1,000 tons of gold. Try to process that number. 1,000 tons. That is equivalent to more than $60 billion today. Now imagine all that gold concentrated in a single city in the middle of the desert, ruled by a single man. The streets of Jerusalem in the 10th century BC were so saturated with wealth that the Bible records something that sounds like an exaggeration, but it isn't. 1 Kings says that silver in Jerusalem was treated like common stone. Silver, one of the most valuable metals in the ancient world, discarded as if it were gravel. But how was this possible? How did a tiny nation, squeezed between the empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, become the wealthiest civilization on the face of the earth? And more importantly, what was it like to live in that city during the absolute peak of its power? To understand what happened in Israel under Solomon, you first need to understand what existed before him. King David, Solomon's father, spent his entire life at war, 40 years of bloody battles against Philistines, Moabites, Ammonites, Arameans, nearly 4 decades of blood, sieges and conquests. When David died, around 970 BC, he left his son something no Israelite king had ever had, a pacified territory. The borders were secure, the enemies were defeated or subjugated, the royal coffers were full of the spoils of war, and there was something else. David left a blueprint, the greatest architectural project Israel would ever conceive. A temple for the God of Israel. David had accumulated materials for decades: gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, precious stones. Everything was prepared. All that was missing was someone with the wisdom to execute it. Solomon ascended the throne at approximately 20 years of age. And the first thing he did was not build the temple. It was not to organize the army. It was not to forge alliances. He asked for wisdom. 2 Chronicles records the prayer, "Give me now wisdom and knowledge." And here enters a detail that completely changes how we understand what came after. God did not just grant the request, he added everything Solomon did not ask for: wealth, honor, power, a prosperity so absurd that no king before or after him would ever experience anything like it. Now close your eyes for a second and imagine that you are approaching Jerusalem in the year 950 BC. You are coming from the south, along the main road that climbs from the desert plains of the Negev. The first thing you notice is the smell. Even before you see the city, the air changes. There is a dense aroma of cedar wood from Lebanon, the noblest in the ancient world, mixed with incense burning on the altars of the temple. This perfume spread throughout the entire city and was carried by the wind for miles. Travelers from other nations reported that it was possible to smell Jerusalem before sighting it. Then you climb the last hill, and you freeze. What opens before your eyes defies any expectation. Jerusalem was not the simple village many people imagine when they think of ancient Israel. Under Solomon, it was transformed into one of the largest and most impressive capitals of the ancient world. At the top of Mount Moriah, dominating the entire landscape, Solomon's temple reflected the sunlight in a way that hurt the eyes. The historian Flavius Josephus, writing centuries later, recorded that the gold plates lining the facade of the temple were so bright that visitors had to look away, as if they were staring at the sun itself. It was not a metaphor. Real, polished gold, covering a structure 30 meters long by 10 wide and 15 high, functioned literally as a giant mirror that captured and amplified sunlight. But the temple was only the beginning. Around it, Solomon built a palace complex that took 13 years to complete, longer than the temple itself, which took 7. 1 Kings 7 describes it piece by piece. The house of the forest of Lebanon, the main hall, was 50 meters long, 25 wide, and 15 high, supported by 4 rows of cedar pillars. Imagine entering this space, the ceiling so high that your voice echoed as if in a cathedral, the polished stone floor reflecting the columns like a dark mirror, the smell of cedar so intense it felt as if you were inside a forest, not a palace. and every column, every beam, every wall panel was made of this noble wood imported directly from the mountains of Lebanon, more than 400 kilometers away. This hall was not the king's bedroom, it was the royal arsenal. First Kings says that Solomon had 300 shields of beaten gold made and hung them there. 300 shields of pure gold lined up on the walls, capturing the light that streamed through the windows. A visitor entering this space for the first time likely stopped and stood in silence, trying to absorb what they were seeing. Now let's go down from the palace and walk through the streets, because this is where the story gets truly fascinating. What was life like for the common citizen in Solomon's Jerusalem? First Kings gives an extraordinary clue. Judah and Israel lived in safety, each man under his own vine and his own fig tree. This phrase seems simple, but it carries an absurd amount of information. In the ancient world, under his own vine and fig tree meant three things. First, you have your own land. Vines and fig trees take years to bear fruit, so planting one meant you had stability, permanence, roots. Second, you have peace. No one plants a vine in the middle of a war zone because an invading army would destroy everything before the first harvest. Third, and this is the detail that impresses the most, you have leisure time. Sitting under the shade of a tree in the heat of the Middle East was the ancient equivalent of being comfortable, relaxed, without worries. If you believe that periods of peace and prosperity are blessings from God, comment there. God is faithful. So what was daily life like? Let's reconstruct it. The sun rises around 5:30 in the morning. The city is already awake. The sound that dominates Jerusalem at dawn is unmistakable. The lowing of oxen, the bleating of sheep and goats, the creaking of wooden cartwheels over stone. Thousands of animals are being led through the city gates toward the temple. Every day, sacrifices were offered on the altar. In the morning and at twilight, without exception, the smell of meat roasting on the bronze braziers of the temple spread through the city even before breakfast, and it was not an unpleasant smell. For the Israelites, that aroma meant that the covenant with God was being maintained. It was the smell of spiritual security. The main streets of Jerusalem were paved with local limestone, whitish, irregular, worn by the traffic of thousands of bare feet and leather sandals. The houses of the common people were built with rough stone, plastered with a mixture of lime and clay, and generally had 2 or 3 rooms on the ground floor with a flat terrace on the roof. This terrace was essential. Families slept up there during the hot months, cooked there, dried fruits and grains in the sun, and it was there that the women wove and talked while looking after the children. Food in Solomon's era was abundant in a way Israel had never experienced. 1 Kings 4:22-23 lists the daily consumption of the royal palace: 30 measures of fine flour, 60 measures of common flour, 10 fattened oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep, not counting deer, gazelles, roebucks and choice fowl. This was the consumption of a single day. We are talking about a court that fed thousands of people, officials, guards, servants, foreign diplomats and their entourages. But the common people also ate well. The basic diet was wheat or barley bread, olives, figs, dates, grapes, lentils, chickpeas and goat cheese. Meat was less frequent for common families, but it was not rare. At religious festivals, which happened several times a year, lambs and kids were roasted and shared in communal meals. Wine was consumed daily, usually diluted with water, and wild honey was used as a sweetener. Imagine a typical breakfast. Flatbread still warm, dipped in thick green olive oil, with a handful of salt-cured olives, pieces of white cheese, and a bunch of dark, sweet grapes picked early in the morning. Simple, but nutritious, fresh and available to practically any family that had a piece of land. Now, if food was abundant, trade was absolutely insane. And this is where Solomon demonstrated a genius that went far beyond spirituality. He transformed Israel into an international commercial hub. Think about the geographical position. Israel sits exactly at the crossroads between three continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. Every piece of merchandise traveling between Egypt and Mesopotamia had to pass through Israelite territory. And Solomon realized the obvious that no king before him had explored. He who controls the road controls the wealth. 1 Kings 10:20-29 describes an operation that today we would call import and re-export. Solomon bought horses from Egypt and from the region of Cilicia in modern-day Turkey and resold them to the Hittite and Aramean kings. He bought war chariots for 600 shekels of silver each and horses for 150. He was the intermediary, the middleman, the international broker of the ancient world. And this was just one of his operations. The fleet of ships from Tarshish, described in 1 Kings 10, went out every 3 years and returned loaded with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. The port of Etzion-Geber, on the Gulf of Aqaba in southern Israel, was the naval base. From there, ships built with the help of the Phoenicians of Tyre, the greatest sailors of the ancient world, sailed through the Red Sea to the eastern coast of Africa and possibly as far as India. Gold came from Ophir, a location that archaeologists still debate today. It could be Somalia, it could be Yemen, it could be the western coast of India. No one knows for sure. But the gold was real. 1 Kings records that a single expedition brought back 420 talents of gold. A talent was equivalent to approximately 34 kilograms. Do the math. That is more than 14 tons of gold in a single trip. And here is the detail no one tells you. Solomon did not depend only on maritime trade. He controlled the overland caravan routes that transported spices from Arabia, silk and precious stones from the east, and copper from the mines of the Arabah. Archaeologists have discovered remains of copper smelters in Timna, in the Negev desert, dated exactly to this period. The scale of the operation was industrial. Enormous furnaces processing tons of ore, producing copper ingots that were exported all over the world. Israel was not just a religious kingdom in the middle of the desert, it was an economic powerhouse. If this surprised you as much as it surprised me while researching, comment, "I didn't know." But the wealth was not just in the king's coffers, it trickled down. 1 Kings 10:27 is the most revealing verse about the general quality of life. The king made silver to be in Jerusalem as common as stones, and cedars as abundant as sycamores in the lowland. This meant that luxury materials were available in sufficient quantity to impact the lives of common people. Families who previously lived in rough stone houses could now have cedar details in their doorframes or terrace pillars. Artisans who previously worked with simple bronze now had access to silver to create jewelry and utensils. Jerusalem's economy under Solomon functioned in layers. At the top, the large international transactions: gold, horses, spices. In the middle, a class of merchants, scribes, and royal officials who lived with significant comfort. At the base, farmers, shepherds, and artisans who, although not rich, lived with more security and abundance than in any previous period of Israel's history. And there was an administrative structure behind all this that was impressive in its organization. 1 Kings 4 lists 12 district governors, each responsible for a specific region of Israel. Each governor had the obligation to supply the royal palace for 1 month of the year: food, supplies, everything. This meant that the weight of maintaining the court was distributed equally among the 12 regions, preventing any one area from being overburdened. Solomon had military commanders, an official chronicler, a secretary of state, a chief priest, a superintendent of the governors, and a palace administrator. We are talking about a functional, organized bureaucracy with defined roles and clear responsibilities, something many kingdoms would not be able to implement for centuries to come. Scribes were central figures in this machine. They recorded commercial transactions, diplomatic treaties, supply inventories, and religious texts. Writing in Israel during this period used Paleo-Hebrew, engraved on pottery fragments called ostraca or on papyrus rolls imported from Egypt. If you walked through the administrative district of Jerusalem, you would see dozens of scribes sitting on stone benches with wet clay tablets on their knees, recording every shipment that entered and left the city gates. The sound of styluses scratching the clay was the sound of the most efficient bureaucracy in the Middle East. But Jerusalem was not just government and trade. There was a cultural and social life vibrating within those walls. And this is where the story gets truly surprising. Solomon was not just a brilliant administrator. 1 Kings 4:32-33 says he composed 3,000 proverbs, 1,005 songs, and spoke about botany and zoology, from the cedars of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls, as well as animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. This was not a weekend hobby. It was systematic research. Solomon was, in modern language, a polymath, someone with mastery over multiple areas of knowledge. And this intellectual interest of the king created an environment where knowledge was valued. Kings and queens from other nations came to Jerusalem specifically to test Solomon's wisdom. The most famous case is that of the Queen of Sheba, described in 1 Kings 10. She traveled likely from the region of modern-day Yemen, a journey of more than 2,000 kilometers across the Arabian desert, with a caravan carrying spices, gold, and precious stones. And the text says she came to test him with hard questions. These were not simple questions. Rabbinic tradition suggests they were riddles, philosophical paradoxes, and questions of governance that she used to test the king's intellectual capacity. And what was her reaction upon seeing Jerusalem and hearing Solomon? 1 Kings 10:5 records it in detail. When she saw the food on the king's table, the housing of his officials, the service of his servants and their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he offered at the temple, the text literally says there was no more breath in her. The Hebrew translation is even more intense. Her spirit left her. She was so impressed that her legs gave way. And look at what she said afterward. In 1 Kings 10:7, I did not believe the reports until I came, and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. She had heard stories about Solomon's wealth and wisdom before traveling. And even so, the reality surpassed everything she imagined. The half had not been told to her. This is a woman who ruled one of the richest kingdoms in Arabia, accustomed to luxury and opulence, and she was left speechless before Jerusalem. Imagine what a peasant coming from a distant village would feel entering this city for the first time. If a queen lost her breath, a simple man likely fell to his knees. But here is the twist that few consider. All this wealth, all this glory, all this peace, it had a price, and the price was being paid in silence, far from the golden halls of the palace, far from the eyes of foreign visitors. 1 Kings 5:13-14 mentions something most people skip when they read the story of Solomon. To build the temple and the palace complex, Solomon called up a forced labor system. 30,000 men from Israel were recruited and sent to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month. 1 month cutting cedars in the mountains of Lebanon, 2 months at home. Besides them, there were 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stonecutters working in the mountain quarries, supervised by 3,300 foremen. Add up those numbers. There are more than 180,000 men involved just in construction. In a population that likely did not exceed 2 million, this meant that nearly 1 in 10 adult men was at any given moment working on the king's projects. The weight was enormous, and it was already beginning to generate a silent resentment, especially in the northern tribes, who felt they were paying a disproportionate price for the glory of Jerusalem, a city in the territory of Judah, Solomon's tribe. But this is a problem that would only explode decades later. For now, the machine worked. The gold flowed, the temple shone, and daily life in Jerusalem continued at a rhythm that no previous generation of Israelites had known, and no subsequent generation would ever recover. And prepare yourself, because what comes next will transport you inside Solomon's temple, and what happened in there is more impressive than anything you have ever been told. You are standing before the entrance of the temple. Two massive bronze columns flank the portal, Jachin and Boaz. Each is nearly 9 meters high, topped with capitals decorated with bronze pomegranates and open lilies. They are so thick that a man hugging one of them would not be able to touch his own fingers on the other side. First Kings gives us the exact dimensions, 18 cubits high, 12 cubits in circumference. The bronze shone, polished daily by the Levites on duty. These columns did not support anything structurally, they were purely symbolic. Jachin meant he will establish, Boaz meant in him is strength. Every person who entered the temple passed between these two declarations. God establishes, God strengthens. It was theology in bronze. But you do not enter, not yet. Because the truth is that the vast majority of people who visited the temple never passed that point. The interior of the sanctuary was restricted, radically restricted. There were layers of access that separated people with absolute rigidity. The outer courtyard was accessible to any Israelite. There stood the great bronze altar where daily sacrifices were burned, a square structure nearly 5 meters high, overlaid with bronze. Beside it, the sea of bronze, a gigantic circular basin resting on 12 bronze oxen containing approximately 44,000 liters of water used for the ritual purifications of the priests. 10 movable bronze stands, each with a smaller basin, completed the set. The hydraulic engineering necessary to keep all this functioning was sophisticated in a way that defies what we imagine for the time. Beyond the outer courtyard, only the priests entered, and inside the temple building itself, there were 2 divisions: the holy place, Hekal in Hebrew, and the Holy of Holies, Devir. The holy place contained 3 objects: the altar of incense, overlaid with pure gold, where a specific mixture of spices was burned twice a day, in the morning and at twilight. The table of the bread of the presence, also covered in gold, where 12 loaves were placed fresh every week, 1 for each tribe of Israel, and 10 pure gold lampstands, not 1, as many people think by confusing it with Moses' tabernacle, 10, 5 on each side, illuminating the environment with a golden flickering light that danced on the gold-covered walls. Because yes, the inner walls of the temple were entirely overlaid with gold. 1 Kings 6:22 is categorical. The whole house he overlaid with gold, not gold details, not decorative gold bands. The whole house, walls, ceiling, floor. Every surface that a priest's eyes touched was gold, and over this gold, cherubim carved in olive wood, palm trees, and open flowers, all covered in more gold. The feeling of being inside, by the light of the lampstands, must have been like being inside something that did not belong to this world. The reflection of the flame multiplied infinitely by golden surfaces. The smell of incense so dense it was almost impossible to breathe normally. The absolute silence, interrupted only by the crackling of the flames and the murmur of priestly prayers. And then there was the Holy of Holies, the Devir, the most sacred place on the face of the earth for the Israelites. A perfect cubic chamber, 10 meters long, 10 wide, 10 high. A cube of pure gold. Inside it, 2 gigantic cherubim carved from olive wood and covered in gold, each 5 meters high and with a 5-meter wingspan from wingtip to wingtip. Their wings touched in the center of the room, forming an arch over the Ark of the Covenant, Israel's most sacred object containing the stone tablets with the 10 commandments written by the very finger of God. No one entered there, no one, except the high priest once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And even he entered with a rope tied to his ankle so he could be pulled out if he died in the presence of God. This was not superstition. It was reverential terror before something they believed to be literally the throne room of the creator of the universe. The space between the wings of the cherubim was, in Israelite theology, the place where God's presence dwelt on earth. When Solomon dedicated the temple, 2 Chronicles 5:14 records that a cloud filled the building, the glory of the Lord, and the priests could not continue to minister. They fell. Men trained since childhood to serve in the sanctuary, accustomed to rituals and ceremonies, simply collapsed before what was happening in that room. The dedication of the temple was likely the greatest public event in Israel's history up to that point. 1 Kings records the numbers of the inaugural sacrifice: 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. These numbers are so absurd that historians still debate today whether they are literal or ceremonial. But even if they are approximations, the scale was colossal. The festival lasted 14 days, 2 full weeks of sacrifices, music, prayers, and banquets. All the people of Israel were invited. People coming from Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the far south, a distance of nearly 250 kilometers. The roads were packed with families traveling on foot, with donkeys carrying children and supplies, sleeping in the open or in improvised tents, moved by something that went beyond a royal decree. They were going to meet God in his new house. Imagine the scene: Jerusalem, a city designed for perhaps 10 or 15,000 inhabitants, receiving tens of thousands of visitors at once. Tents set up on every available piece of land outside the walls, campfires lit everywhere at nightfall, roasting the meat of the sacrifices, the sound of hundreds of Levites singing and playing, harps, lyres, cymbals, trumpets echoing through the valleys around the city, children running between the tents without fully understanding what was happening, but feeling the energy of something enormous. And at the center of it all, at the top of Mount Moriah, the temple shining like a gold star under the moonlight. If this scene moved you, leave your like on this video. This helps me continue bringing this type of content. The music, by the way, deserves an entire chapter, because the Israelite musical tradition under Solomon reached a level that would influence religious worship for the next 3,000 years. 1 Chronicles 25 lists the musicians appointed by David and maintained by Solomon, 288 trained singers divided into 24 shifts, led by music masters from the families of Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun. These were not amateurs. They were professionals who spent their entire lives perfecting their art. Training began in childhood. Sons of musicians were initiated by their fathers into the instruments and sacred melodies. The tradition passed from generation to generation with a fidelity that today we would call conservatorial. The instruments were diverse. The nevel, a large harp with perhaps 10 or 12 strings, producing deep, resonant notes that filled the temple courtyard. The kinnor, a smaller, higher-pitched, more versatile lyre that could accompany both songs of lament and hymns of celebration. Metziltayim, bronze cymbals that marked the rhythm with metallic clashes. And the chatzotzrot, silver trumpets, long and straight, used to announce ceremonial moments with a piercing sound that could be heard throughout Jerusalem. When the 120 priest trumpeters played in unison, as described in 2 Chronicles, the sound was so powerful that residents of the villages around Jerusalem could hear it miles away. The Psalms, many of which were composed during this period or slightly before, were the basis of the repertoire. But they were not recited as poetry. They were sung in elaborate melodies with harmonies that the Levites practiced for hours every day. Psalm 150, for example, was an explosion of sound. Praise the Lord with trumpets, with harp and lyre, with tambourine and dancing, with strings and flute, with clashing cymbals. Every instrument mentioned had a specific role in the temple orchestra. It was not noise. It was a musical structure thought out, rehearsed, and executed with precision. And the music was not restricted to the temple. In homes, at parties, at weddings, at harvests, music was the sonic fabric of Israelite life. The Book of the Song of Solomon, attributed to the king himself, is a set of love poems set to music that gives us an unexpected window into the emotional and intimate life of the people. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. This sensory, passionate, earthly language was not considered profane. It was celebrated as a legitimate part of the human experience, a civilization that could produce at the same time the solemn reverence of the temple and the erotic poetry of the Song of Songs was a deeply complex civilization, more than most modern representations suggest. Now let's talk about something that is rarely mentioned when discussing Solomon's kingdom: education. Because no society reaches this level of administrative, commercial, and cultural complexity without an intellectual training system functioning behind it. Proverbs 1:8 begins with, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching." This is the basic educational structure, the family. Fathers taught trades and laws to sons. Mothers taught practical wisdom and oral tradition to daughters. But under Solomon, there were additional layers. The scribes we mentioned earlier did not appear out of nowhere. They were trained in schools linked to the temple and the palace, where they learned to read and write in Paleo-Hebrew, to master basic arithmetic for accounting, and to memorize entire sections of the law and the Psalms. Archaeologists have found abecedaries, pottery tablets with the alphabet repeated several times, clearly used as calligraphy exercises, dated to this period in various Israelite sites. This suggests that literacy was not restricted only to the palace elite. At least a significant portion of the urban population knew how to read and write at a functional level. When Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go," it was not an abstract metaphor. It was a concrete social guideline being practiced in an organized way for the first time in Israel's history. And Solomon's Proverbs themselves reveal the type of mindset he was trying to cultivate in his people. They were not just religious sayings, they were principles for practical life. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish. He will not even bring it back to his mouth. Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. These proverbs covered personal finance, social relations, work ethics, conflict management, and self-control. They were, in essence, a curriculum of emotional intelligence and practical wisdom packaged in short, memorable and accessible phrases. A farmer who could not read could hear a proverb once and repeat it for the rest of his life. It was knowledge transmission technology perfectly adapted for a predominantly oral culture. Now let's open a window that almost no one opens when talking about ancient Israel, the life of women in Solomon's Jerusalem. Proverbs 31 describes the so-called virtuous woman, and if you read carefully, the portrait that emerges is anything but that of a passive housewife. This woman buys and sells property. She plants vineyards with her own money. She manufactures linen fabrics and sells them to merchants. She imports food from afar. She manages employees. She wakes up before dawn to organize household tasks. And the text says she speaks with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. We are talking about a businesswoman, manager, educator, and entrepreneur in the 10th century BC. Of course, the society was patriarchal. Men held legal and religious authority. Women did not serve as priestesses, did not hold public office, and were legally dependent on fathers or husbands in many matters. But within the domestic sphere, and the domestic sphere in the ancient world, was enormous, encompassing economic production, education, and property management. Israelite women had an influence that is often underestimated. In the Jerusalem market, women sold textiles, pottery, prepared foods, and medicinal herbs. On the terraces of the houses, they commanded the production of wool and linen threads that fed one of Israel's most important industries. Purple-dyed wool, extracted from Mediterranean mollusks, was so valuable that a cloak could cost the equivalent of months of a worker's salary. And speaking of the market, let's walk through the Jerusalem Shuk. Because it is there, in the middle of the noise and chaos, that you really feel the pulse of the city. The market was likely located near the main gates, where the traffic of goods was most intense. Ancient city gates were not just entrances, they were centers of social activity. There, elders sat to resolve legal disputes. Merchants set up improvised stalls, travelers stopped to drink water and exchange news. The gate was the court, the stock exchange, and the social network of Jerusalem, all at the same time. Imagine yourself there in the middle of the morning. The heat has already begun to press. There is a stall selling pottery from Cyprus, vessels painted with geometric patterns in red and black, imported by Phoenician ships. Beside it, an Egyptian merchant displays rolls of very fine linen, so thin it was almost transparent, used by the wives of palace officials. In the next stall, spices from Arabia, frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, cassia, piled in woven straw baskets, filling the air with a perfume that makes your eyes sting. One man shouts prices in Hebrew, another responds in Phoenician, a third negotiates in Egyptian. Jerusalem under Solomon was a polyglot, cosmopolitan city, pulsing with the energy of an international commercial center. Transactions did not use coins. The minting of coins would only be invented centuries later in Lydia. Instead, the system was based on the weight of metals. Pieces of silver or gold were weighed on portable scales using standardized stone weights. The shekel, which weighed approximately 11 grams, was the basic unit. Proverbs 11:1 warns, "A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight." The fact that this proverb exists tells us two things: that commercial fraud was common enough to need condemnation, and that there was a religious ethical standard being applied to economic transactions. Trade in Israel was not just business. It was a moral arena where God's justice was tested with every weighing of silver. Besides metal, bartering worked for smaller transactions. A farmer could trade a jar of oil for a pair of leather sandals. A weaver could trade a cloak for a month's supply of grain. The economy was hybrid, sophisticated in large international transactions, simple and direct in daily exchanges between neighbors. But there was an aspect of life in Jerusalem that united rich and poor, merchants and farmers, priests and artisans, the religious festivals. And it is impossible to understand life under Solomon without understanding the festive cycle that organized the nation's entire calendar. 3 times a year, every Israelite man was required to present himself before the Lord in Jerusalem. Pesach in the spring, celebrating the exit from Egypt. Shavuot, 7 weeks later, the festival of harvests and the giving of the law on Sinai. And Sukkot in the autumn, the festival of booths, when families built temporary huts of palm leaves and branches and lived in them for 7 days, remembering the 40 years Israel spent in the desert. Sukkot was the greatest of all. Coming right after Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, it was an explosion of joy after a period of introspection and repentance. Deuteronomy commands, "Rejoice in your festival." It does not suggest, it commands. Joy was a commandment. Entire families camped in the huts set up on house terraces, in backyards, in the streets. At night, torches illuminated the temple courtyard, and the Levites sang the Psalms of Ascent. Psalms 120 to 134, one after another, as pilgrims climbed in procession the steps of Mount Moriah. Wine flowed generously. Children played among the booths decorated with hanging fruit. Old men told stories of the desert to grandchildren who listened with wide eyes. And above all, hovering over the entire city, the incessant sound of the temple music and the glow of gold under the torchlight. It was in these moments that Israel's cohesion became tangible. Tribes that during the rest of the year lived hundreds of kilometers apart, met, negotiated marriages, resolved disputes, and renewed family ties. The festivals were not just religious events, they were the social glue that kept the 12 tribes functioning as a nation. And under Solomon, with the temple finally built and peace guaranteed at the borders, these celebrations reached a scale and intensity they had never reached before. But if the festivals united Israel, there was another force operating in Jerusalem that silently began to divide it. And this force had an unexpected face. In fact, it had many faces, 700 to be exact, because Solomon, the wisest man on earth, committed the oldest mistake in human history, and the consequences would be catastrophic. 1 Kings 11:3 records the number with almost brutal frankness: 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, 1,000 women. And the text does not stop there. It adds, "And his wives turned away his heart." Now, before you imagine a soap opera harem, understand the context. In the ancient world, royal marriages were not about romance. They were diplomatic treaties signed in flesh and blood. Each wife represented an alliance sealed with blood. Marrying the daughter of a neighboring king meant that king would not attack your borders, because he would be attacking his own son-in-law, the man who slept with his daughter and who would father his grandchildren. Solomon took this strategy to the absolute extreme. He married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt, and this was so significant that the biblical text mentions this marriage repeatedly, as if the narrator himself could not believe it. Pharaohs did not give their daughters to anyone. Diplomatic letters from the time found in the Amarna archives show pharaohs responding to marriage requests from foreign kings with a phrase that became famous in ancient diplomacy. From time immemorial, no daughter of the king of Egypt has been given to anyone. That Solomon secured this wife says more about Israel's power at that moment than any description of wealth or army ever could. But the Egyptian princess was only the most famous. There were Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, each coming from a different people, each bringing her own language, her own customs, and, this is the point, her own gods. And they did not come alone. A foreign princess arrived in Jerusalem with an entire entourage. Servants, personal priests, artisans who knew how to build altars in the style of her homeland, cooks who prepared ritual offerings according to her people's tradition. It was a complete package, and here is the problem Solomon should have foreseen, because God, literally, had foreseen it for him. Deuteronomy contains a direct instruction for any future king of Israel. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. The law was clear, the reason was explicit, and Solomon, the man who wrote 3,000 proverbs about wisdom and self-control, ignored it all. In the beginning, it probably seemed harmless. A Moabite wife wants a small altar to burn incense to Chemosh. It is just a gesture of respect. A Sidonian princess wants a sanctuary for Ashtoreth in the palace garden. It is diplomacy. An Ammonite concubine cries with homesickness and asks for a place to pray to Molech. What harm can it do? The problem is that Chemosh was not just any god. The biblical text calls him the abomination of the Moabites, and Molech was even worse, a deity associated with child sacrifice. Leviticus 22 prescribed the death penalty for any Israelite who offered their children to Molech. And Solomon, the builder of the temple of the God of Israel, built altars for these gods on the hills east of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives, which would forever be associated with the presence of God, was stained by pagan shrines erected by the very king who had dedicated the temple with the most beautiful words in Israelite literature. 1 Kings 11:4 describes the progression with surgical precision. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God. as was the heart of David, his father. Notice the choice of words. It does not say Solomon abandoned God. It says his heart was no longer whole. He did not trade one for the other. He tried to have both. He worshipped in the temple in the morning and burned incense to Ashtoreth in the afternoon. And this is exactly the most dangerous type of corruption. Not dramatic apostasy, but gradual erosion. The soul that rots not all at once, but slowly, concession after concession, until the man who knelt before the God of Israel with tears in his eyes can no longer distinguish between worship and superstition. And God responded. 1 Kings records the sentence, "Since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant." But even in judgment, there was mercy, or at least calculation. God adds, "Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. And even then, not all of it. One tribe I will give to your son, for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen." The sentence was signed. The unified kingdom of Israel had an expiration date, and the clock was already ticking. But the signs of the fracture did not begin at the pagan altars. They began much earlier, in the very foundations of the temple. Because those magnificent stones, that fragrant cedar wood, that gleaming gold, all of it was built on something the biblical text mentions almost in passing, but which historians recognize as the true breaking point: forced labor. 1 Kings records that Solomon drafted 30,000 men from all Israel to work in the timber cuts in Lebanon, 10,000 a month in rotating shifts. They went for 1 month, returned for 2, and went again. Besides these, there were 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stonecutters in the mountains, supervised by 3,300 foremen. Do the math. There are more than 180,000 men taken from their families, their fields, their workshops, to serve one man's construction project. And the text makes a distinction that is crucial. 1 Kings 9 claims Solomon did not enslave Israelites. He used them as soldiers, officials, and commanders. The enslaved were the remnants of the Canaanite peoples who had not been expelled. But 1 Kings 5 contradicts this comfortable distinction. The corvée, the forced labor, was imposed on all Israel. And for a farmer torn from his crops for 1 month out of every 3, the difference between corvée and slavery was in practice academic. Put yourself in this man's place. You have a farm in the territory of Ephraim, about 100 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Your family depends on your presence at planting time, at harvest time, in maintaining the terraces, in pruning the olive trees. And suddenly, a palace official arrives with a royal decree. You have been drafted. You must report to such a place, on such a date, to cut wood in Lebanon or carry stones in Jerusalem. Your wife will be alone with the children. Your oldest sons, who have barely entered adolescence, will have to take on the work of an adult man. If the harvest fails in your absence, hunger will not wait for your shift to end. And for what? So the king can build another palace, another throne hall, another stable for his horses imported from Egypt. The generation that accepted the sacrifice for the temple because it was the house of God no longer had the same willingness to accept the sacrifice for yet another palace complex. The difference between building for God and building for king's ego was felt in every aching muscle, in every month away from home, and the tax burden was equally crushing. Those 12 administrative districts we mentioned earlier, each responsible for feeding the palace for 1 month a year, that meant that 1/12 of everything you produced went to Jerusalem, 30 fat oxen a day, 100 sheep, flour, grains, honey, oil. The numbers in 1 Kings 4 are impressive when read as a royal menu, but they are devastating when read from the perspective of the farmer who had to deliver his best production to a palace he would never see the inside of. And here emerges a tension that will define Israel's future. the tension between north and south. The northern tribes, led by Ephraim and Manasseh, were the most productive and the most populous. But Jerusalem was in the south, in the territory of Judah, Solomon's tribe. The northerners felt, with some reason, that they were financing the greatness of a city that was not theirs, serving the projects of a king who favored his own people. The seed of resentment was planted, watered with every batch of forced workers, fertilized with every shipment of grain and cattle sent south. And it was in this fertile soil of frustration that a name emerged that would change everything. Jeroboam, son of Nebat, an Ephraimite, a man of the north. 1 Kings describes him as a man of standing, valiant, capable, ambitious. Solomon recognized his talent and placed him as supervisor over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. It was like handing the fox the keys to the chicken coop, because Jeroboam was seeing from inside the system exactly how that system crushed his own people. He saw the men of his tribe bent under the weight of the stones. He heard their complaints at night, in the labor camps. He knew the names of the families who went hungry because the father was in Jerusalem carrying cedar for yet another palace floor. And then, one day, a prophet met him on the road. Ahijah the Shilonite wearing a new cloak. Without saying a word, Ahijah took the cloak and tore it into 12 pieces. He gave 10 to Jeroboam. "Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and will give you 10 tribes. The prophecy was explicit, irreversible. 10 out of 12 tribes would be torn from the house of David. When Solomon found out, he tried to kill Jeroboam, the wisest man in the world, reacting with the most primitive instinct, eliminate the threat. But Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where he found asylum with Pharaoh Shishak, and there he stayed, waiting for the clock to finish counting down, waiting for the richest king in history to close his eyes for the last time. Meanwhile, Jerusalem kept shining. The gold still covered the temple. The caravans still arrived from Ophir. The ships of Tarshish still docked in Ezion-Geber. The Egyptian horses still neighed in the royal stables. On the outside, nothing had changed. The golden age remained golden, but on the inside, in the heart of the king, in the mood of the northern tribes, in the invisible cracks that ran through the structure of the kingdom like veins in a block of stone about to split, everything had already changed. 1 Kings 11:41-43. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon and all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the Acts of Solomon? And the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers, and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. 40 years, the same duration as David's reign, the same duration as the Exodus in the desert, a number that in the Hebrew mindset meant completeness, a whole cycle from start to finish, with nothing missing. But notice what the text does not say. When David died, the record celebrates his life with affection and reverence. When Solomon dies, the text is dry, mechanical, almost bureaucratic. He slept with his fathers. His son reigned in his place, period. As if the narrator did not want to linger, as if there was something too uncomfortable to elaborate on. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he took the throne, old enough to be competent. But he had grown up in the palace, surrounded by the luxury that other men's forced labor had built. He had never felt the weight of a stone. He had never seen the sun rise over a wheat field he himself had plowed. And the first test came immediately. The northern tribes sent a delegation, and the spokesman was Jeroboam, recently returned from exile in Egypt with the authority of one carrying a prophecy on his back. The request was simple, direct, reasonable. Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you. It was not rebellion. It was negotiation. They were offering loyalty in exchange for relief. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to think. He first consulted the elders, Solomon's veteran advisors, men aged in diplomacy and administration. They said, "Concede. If you will be a servant to this people today and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever. Serve the people, and the people will serve you." An equation as old as the very idea of government. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the old men. He preferred to listen to the young men he had grown up with, sons of officials raised in the same luxury, infected by the same arrogance. And the answer they advised became immortalized as one of the greatest diplomatic blunders in history. 1 Kings 12:14. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." Scorpions, not the animals. It was the name of a whip with metal tips that tore the flesh. Rehoboam did not just refuse to lighten the load, he promised to make it worse, and he promised it with sadism. The response from the north was immediate. "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel." The cry of separation echoed through the valleys. 10 tribes rose up and marched home. The unified kingdom, David's great work, Solomon's heritage, the dream of generations, split into 2 halves in a single afternoon. Israel to the north, Judah to the south, and they would never be reunited. The golden age had ended, not with a foreign invasion, not with a plague or an earthquake, but with the slow accumulation of mistakes that no amount of gold could cover. Forced labor that exhausted the people's patience, taxation that emptied the northern granaries to fill the southern banquets, political marriages that brought foreign gods to the sacred hills, and an heir who confused power with right and cruelty with strength. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of Solomon's reign, not the gold, not the temple, not the proverbs, but the lesson that a civilization can reach the absolute peak of wealth, wisdom, and power and still contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction. That the same hand that builds the most beautiful building on earth can dig, without realizing it, the grave where it will be buried. The later prophets would look back and see in this period not just glory, but a warning. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They would all return to Solomon as an example of what happens when a heart is divided between God and everything else. When wisdom becomes self-reliance. When blessing becomes an entitlement. When the man who has everything decides that everything is still not enough. But before we close, I need to show you something, because everything you have heard so far, the temple, the palace, the mines, the fleets, the festivals, the music, the proverbs, the 1,000 women, all of it existed within an absurdly small interval of time. 40 years, a single life. When Solomon ascended the throne, Israel was a promising regional kingdom. When he died, it was a civilization that had touched heights most ancient nations would never reach, even in centuries. But the morning after his death, when the sun rose over the Golden Temple and illuminated the same walls, the same courtyards, the same columns, the world that sun illuminated was already different. The stones were the same. The gold was the same. But the spirit that had given meaning to everything was already cracked. And from that crack would be born wars, exiles, destructions, and a dispersion that would last millennia. It all started here, in the brightest and most dangerous era of Israel's history, in the life of a man who had everything and who, in the end, discovered what Ecclesiastes 1:2 already knew from the beginning: vanity of vanities, all is vanity. If you have made it this far, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I prepared it especially for those who watch this one until the end. And perhaps you are thinking, this was 3,000 years ago. What does an Israelite king who lived in the Bronze Age have to do with me? Everything. Because Solomon's pattern is not ancient, it is eternal. Look around. We live in an era that Solomon would recognize immediately. We have more information than any previous civilization and less ability to distinguish the essential from the superfluous. We have more comfort than any generation before us and more anxiety, more connections and more loneliness. We build our own temples of glass and steel, our palaces of data and algorithms, our thrones of followers and likes. And in the middle of all this, we repeat Solomon's mistake exactly. We believe that accumulating is the same as conquering, that having is the same as being, that the next acquisition will finally fill the space the previous one didn't. The man who wrote there is a time to plant and a time to uproot what was planted did not know how to recognize the time to stop. The man who said the end of a matter is better than its beginning did not know how to finish well. And that is the tragedy that makes Solomon so human, so painfully recognizable. It is not the fall of the monster that scares us. It is the fall of the genius, the fall of the man who knew exactly what was right and still chose the opposite. Because wisdom that does not rule the heart of its possessor is just information. And information without character is the most dangerous thing in the world. Solomon proved that, and we keep proving it every day, every time we know what we should do, and do the opposite. If you have made it this far, click on the next video appearing on your screen. I set it aside especially for those who watch this one until the end.